Have you ever wondered how a group of scattered colonies without a real army, without money, without unity, without experience managed to take on the most powerful empire in the world and actually win? What drove ordinary farmers and merchants to pick up muskets and challenge a king? Why did a war that began over taxes turn into a full-scale revolution that changed the future of the world? And how did 13 colonies, each with different cultures, religions, and interests, somehow unite to create a brand new nation? In this video, I'm going to break down all of this. The background of the American Revolution, the events that pushed Britain and the colonies into war, the battles that defined the struggle, the reasons behind the surprising American victory, and the global impact of this conflict. So without any delay, let's start. The story of the American Revolution begins long before the first shot was fired. For generations, the 13 colonies were loyal to the British Crown. They considered themselves Englishmen, shared British culture, British law, British literature, and British identity. But because they lived far away across the Atlantic Ocean, they developed their own habits, more freedom, more self-rule through local assemblies, and less interference from the king. Britain, busy with its global empire, mostly ignored them. This era would later be called salutary neglect, and during this time the colonies grew confident, wealthy, and used to running their own affairs. Everything changed after the 7 Years' War, a massive global conflict that Britain won, but at a heavy cost. The victory forced Britain into deep debt, and the government decided that since the colonies benefited from this war, especially by being protected from France, the colonies should help pay for it. For Britain, this made perfect sense. But for the colonists, who had never been taxed directly by Parliament, it felt like a violation of their rights. They believed that only their own elected assemblies had the authority to tax them. So when laws like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and later the Townshend Acts were imposed, anger spread like wildfire. Soon the issue became bigger than money. It became a question of principle. No taxation without representation wasn't just a slogan. It was a demand for dignity. The colonists wanted their voice heard in the laws that governed them. But Britain insisted that Parliament represented all British subjects, even if they lived thousands of kilometers away. This philosophical clash slowly transformed frustration into hostility. Tensions exploded in 1770 in the infamous Boston Massacre, when British soldiers fired on a crowd, killing 5 colonists. The incident widened the crack between Britain and the colonies. And then came the Tea Act of 1773, which sparked the Boston Tea Party. Colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into the harbor. For Britain, this was a direct insult to royal authority. For colonists, it was a bold statement of resistance. Britain responded with the coercive acts known in America as the Intolerable Acts, which punished Massachusetts by closing Boston as port and tightening control. Instead of scaring the colonies into obedience, these measures united them. For the first time, the colonies formed the First Continental Congress, a gathering of representatives determined to defend their rights. By now the situation was dangerous. Mutual distrust filled the air. Britain sent more troops to maintain order, and colonial militias began secretly gathering weapons. Both sides waited for the other to make the first move. That moment arrived in April of 1775 at Lexington and Concord, where British troops marched to seize colonial arms, and the colonists stood armed to stop them. Shots were fired. No one knows who pulled the trigger first, but those shots became known as the shot heard around the world. The American Revolution had officially begun. Once war started, a full-scale conflict quickly followed. The Second Continental Congress appointed George Washington as commander of the Continental Army, a tall, reserved Virginian with experience from earlier wars. Washington understood that the colonies did not need to defeat Britain in open battle. They only needed to survive. Britain needed to crush the rebellion completely. America only needed to endure long enough to force Britain to give up. The Siege of Boston became Washington's first major operation. While the British were stuck in the city, Washington reorganized the militias into a functioning army. Then, using cannons dragged all the way from Fort Ticonderoga by Henry Knox, he fortified the hills around Boston. The British realized they were vulnerable and withdrew by sea. For the colonists, this early success was a sign that they could stand up to imperial power. Meanwhile, political changes were happening fast. The idea of full independence, once unthinkable, started gaining support. Pamphlets, especially Thomas Paine's Common Sense, argued that it was absurd for a distant king to rule a continent. The dream of a new kind of nation won without a king spread across the colonies. And on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, declaring the colonies free and sovereign states. It wasn't just a political statement. It was a gamble with everything at stake. Britain reacted with overwhelming force. Tens of thousands of soldiers, including Hessian mercenaries from Germany, were sent to crush the rebellion. The first major campaign of this new phase of war was in New York in 1776. Washington suffered heavy defeats. Outnumbered and inexperienced, his army was pushed out of New York and suffered a series of demoralizing losses. Many believed the revolution was collapsing before it even began. But Washington refused to give up. When morale was at its lowest, he took one of the boldest gambles in American military history. On Christmas night, 1776, he crossed the icy Delaware River with his men and launched a surprise attack on Hessian forces at Trenton. The victory electrified the colonies. Suddenly the revolution had hope again. Yet the war was far from over. Britain carried out a grand strategy in 1777 to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. The plan involved General Burgoyne marching down from Canada while British forces moved up from New York, but everything fell apart. Burgoyne's army was slowed by harsh terrain and constant militia attacks. In the end, he was surrounded and forced to surrender at Saratoga. Saratoga became the turning point of the entire war. It showed the world that the Americans could win battles, and it convinced France to openly support the revolution. French money, weapons, supplies, and eventually troops and naval power transformed the conflict. What had been a colonial rebellion suddenly became an international war. Washington, meanwhile, endured the bitter winter of Valley Forge in 1777–78. Thousands of soldiers suffered from hunger, disease, and cold. But it was also at Valley Forge that the Continental Army was reborn. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, the army learned discipline, formations, bayonet use, and battlefield tactics. By spring, the Americans were no longer a collection of militias, they were a professional fighting force. And yet the war dragged on, brutal and unpredictable. British forces shifted their focus to the south, believing that loyalists would support them there. Cities such as Savannah and Charleston fell. The Southern campaign was brutal, filled with massacres, raids, and back-and-forth skirmishes. American General Nathanael Greene used a strategy of avoiding major battles, instead wearing the British down through constant movement and hit-and-run attacks. His famous line captured the strategy perfectly: "We fight, get beat, rise and fight again." While the British won many battles, they could never break the resistance. Slowly, Greene's method forced the British army into exhaustion. And by 1781, all roads in the war led to a small Virginia town called Yorktown. As British General Charles Cornwallis entrenched his army at Yorktown, he expected the Royal Navy to rescue him whenever needed. But this time, the sea would not save the British. Thanks to the French alliance, a powerful French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed into the Chesapeake Bay and blocked British reinforcements from entering. For the first time in the entire war, Britain lost control of the sea at a crucial moment. Washington immediately saw the opportunity. In a brilliant move, he pretended to prepare for an attack on New York, but secretly marched his entire army south hundreds of kilometers, joining French forces led by General Rochambeau. The combined Franco-American army surrounded Yorktown, and in October 1781, the siege began. What followed was a methodical and crushing bombardment that shook Cornwallis's defenses day and night. American and French troops dug trenches closer and closer to the British lines, capturing key positions with bayonet charges. The noose tightened around Cornwallis's army. Surrounded, outnumbered, and with no reinforcements coming, Cornwallis realized the truth. The war was lost. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered more than 7,000 soldiers. It was not the last battle of the war, but it was the one that broke Britain's will. When news of the defeat reached London, shock spread throughout Parliament. The political cost, the financial burden, and the diplomatic complications were too much. Britain was fighting not just America, but France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. It simply wasn't worth continuing. Peace negotiations began soon after, and in 1783 the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain acknowledged the independence of the United States. The war that once seemed impossible for the Americans to win had ended in their favor. But the more interesting question is, why did they win? How did an underdeveloped, divided group of colonies defeat a global superpower? The answer lies in several key factors. The most important was the American strategy of endurance. Washington knew he didn't have to defeat Britain outright. He only had to prevent total collapse. Every time the Continental Army survived a major campaign, the Revolution survived with it. Washington's leadership steady, patient, discipline kept the army alive even during the darkest years. Then came geography. Britain was fighting a war across an ocean where supplies, soldiers, and communication were delayed by weeks or sometimes months. America's vast landscape made it extremely difficult for Britain to control territory. Even when the British captured cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, they couldn't control the countryside, where patriot militias kept resisting. Foreign support was another decisive factor. The French alliance reshaped the war. Without French money, the Continental Army would have collapsed financially. Without French weapons, the Americans would have struggled to arm their troops. Without the French Navy, the victory at Yorktown would never have happened. Spain and the Dutch also played important roles, stretching Britain's resources thin by fighting them in Europe and the Caribbean. Internal British politics also contributed to the American victory. Many British citizens saw the war as unnecessary, expensive, and poorly managed. Parliament was divided, and leaders frequently changed. The war was unpopular and draining, and the British government simply couldn't justify fighting endlessly against a determined population thousands of kilometers away. And finally, ideology mattered. The Americans weren't just fighting for territory or taxes, they were fighting for a new identity, a new kind of political system. That sense of purpose gave them a unity and motivation that the British Army couldn't match. They believed their future, their rights, and their very dignity were at stake. When people fight for what they see as their fundamental freedom, they become extremely difficult to conquer. The end of the American Revolution didn't just create a new nation, it changed the world. It introduced a radical idea, that a people could overthrow a monarchy and build a nation based on principles, not royalty. It inspired movements everywhere. The French Revolution took inspiration from it. Independence struggles in Latin America looked to the American model. Even reformers in Europe saw it as proof that ordinary citizens could shape their own government. But the long-term effects went far beyond politics. The United States became a laboratory of new ideas: religious freedom, constitutional governance, separation of powers, representative democracy. These concepts were debated and tested, sometimes successfully, sometimes with difficulty, but they set a model for nations that would emerge centuries later. Economically, the end of British restrictions allowed America to expand westward, trade globally, and grow into a major force. Culturally, the Revolution created a mythology that shaped American identity: stories of Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, and countless unnamed soldiers who fought for liberty. Yet the Revolution also left behind unresolved contradictions. The issue of slavery remained untouched in the peace agreements. Even though the language of the revolution, freedom, equality, natural rights, stood in direct conflict with the institution. The Native American populations suffered greatly as the new nation expanded west, pushing them off their lands. Women, who contributed significantly to the war effort, still lacked political rights. These tensions would influence American society for centuries. Still, despite its imperfections and its unfinished promises, the American Revolution marked the beginning of one of the most influential nations in history. A war born from taxes, misunderstandings, and political pride eventually created a country that would go on to reshape the global order. And when you look back at Lexington and Concord at Washington, crossing the Delaware at Valley Forge at Saratoga, and finally at Yorktown, it becomes clear that the American Revolution wasn't just a war, it was the creation of an idea. An idea powerful enough to inspire millions, shape continents, and redefine what people believed about government and human rights. As we conclude this story, a final question remains for you. Do you think the American Revolution was truly inevitable? Or could the conflict between Britain and the colonies have been peacefully resolved if both sides had acted differently? I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments.